Tech companies have a mantra of fail fast, fail often. This is in contrast to an organization like NASA, who could have the phrase try not to fail, or Boeing, who prefers the simpler fail. While NASA would prefer to do things methodically, making sure to check all the boxes along the way, SpaceX would rather just take an educated guess, build something, strap a bunch of sensors to it, and see what happens. You can learn a lot very quickly the second way. I also do things this way, but not because I'm trying to disrupt any paradigms. It's because it's just more fun to do it that way. Most of the time, I'd rather just build something and see what happens, even knowing that I might have to build it twice. There are a lot of things you can't learn unless you just dive into the deep end, the unknown unknowns, the complex interaction of parts. Even your goals. You might not know what you really want until you just go for it and find out that's not actually what you want. But enough about my dating life. If you've been watching this channel for a long time, you probably remember that I made a video a while back about the tail end of the land speed car, where I made this part, the back section, the tail. Well, today we are going to completely remake it. It's hard to figure out what's going on in the world today. Sure, there are a lot of news sources, but they each have their own biases and viewpoints. It seems like you can't really know what happened unless you read 50,000 different articles. Or just go to Ground News. Ground News gathers news from 50,000 different news sources every day and puts everything you need to know right at the top. Take a look at this story on China's recent moon mission. It has 188 sources with a 43% center bias distribution and only 18 stories coming from right-leaning sources. You can scroll down and immediately see the headlines and information about the source's political bias, reliability, and ownership. This way you can easily compare headlines to see how bias affects framing. And with one click, you can see the bias comparison at the top. If you want to see what else the left or right-leaning sources are ignoring, you can see it all here with their blind spot feed, which specifically covers stories underreported by either side of the political spectrum. My favorite part of Ground News is that it simplifies the chaos. It very quickly shows me who is talking about the story, what they're saying, and if I want to know more, I can scroll down and find a highly factual source rather than someone's opinion. Ground News is fully subscriber funded, and your subscription helps support a platform trying to make the news media more transparent and accountable. Go to ground.news/Superfast Matt to become a smarter news consumer and see every side of every story. Subscribe through my link for 40% off unlimited access this month. We've already done this part of the new tail, the tubes that the parachutes go in. We made them out of carbon fiber a few months ago. The first time around, we made them with some exhaust tube for an 18-wheeler. They are 5-inch diameter steel and kind of heavy. Weight isn't much of a concern for land speed cars, except that I do need to remove the tail from time to time, and the heavier it is, the harder it is to remove and move around. Aerodynamics, however, is super important, and the new rounded rectangular shape let me narrow the body in the back a bit to reduce drag. I couldn't just go with a smaller diameter because then the parachutes won't fit in there, so a rounded rectangle it was. They are about 3 feet long, and there are 2 of them, and I am using 2 separate parachutes. One of them I bought from a racing company and is specifically made for my speed and weight of race car. It was $700. The other one was $25 and was sitting on a shelf in a military surplus store since the Vietnam War. I know at least one other team has used this exact parachute dozens if not hundreds of times, so I know it's good, but I would like to be able to use either of these in the future for both tubes. So the tubes are sized to fit the larger parachute. To fit the smaller chute, I made this adjustable spacer that goes in the tube. I made it adjustable because parachutes tend to get bigger or smaller as they pick up dust and get used throughout the day. It's 2 different colors because I ran out of printer filament. The fancy parachute comes with a long nylon rope that attaches it to the car, but the one from the Vietnam War did not, so I had to make one. I bought some nylon loop strap, but I thought it might not be strong enough, so I bought some smaller loop strap and put it inside, and then I put a piece of nylon rope inside that, making the turducken of parachute lines. I think this is called a bridle, but that might just be the line between the pilot chute and the main chute. Speaking of pilot chute, this has been modified. Typically these have a coiled up spring sewn into the nylon that shoots it out into the wind, but these springs don't fit into my new rectangular tubes, so I made some. You can just buy spring steel and bend it yourself. It's pretty easy. I think these will work, but I don't love them. I'll probably get a couple of these small spring pilot chutes and squish them into ovals in the vise. But anyway, I have tubes, chutes, and all of the associated hardware. Now I just need something to attach it to. This is the original structure. It's been sitting in my yard for a year, collecting rust and waiting to be thrown away. It's very long. I had originally designed the tail of this car to be almost 6 feet long because that gave me a very gradual taper in the rear. I thought this would help keep drag down, but it's actually worse. There are two kinds of aerodynamic drag we're concerned with here. The first kind is pressure drag. That's the pressure from the air pushing back on the car, the force it takes to move the air out of the way so you can shove a race car through it. This is usually the largest component of total drag, so much so that you can sometimes just ignore the other kind of drag, friction drag. This is usually a very small component of drag because cars are big, they disrupt a lot of air, and they usually only get up to about 80 miles per hour. My car is small, it disrupts the air a tiny bit, and hopefully it will go faster than 80 miles per hour. So the skin friction drag is a considerable portion of the total drag. No matter how smooth you make a surface, there will always be skin friction drag, and the more skin you have, the more drag you have. The long tail like this helps reduce pressure drag, but it increases the skin friction drag more. I figured all of this out doing CFD analysis with AirShaper. So the new tail is shorter by a fair bit. I could have just chopped off this front part of the tail here and used this section, but there were other things I wanted to change as well, like those parachute tubes, so I just made a new structure. The obvious change here is this spine up top. My old tail didn't have mounting provisions for a vertical stabilizer, but now I have a ham sandwich infused vertical stabilizer, so I need to mount that somewhere. With the help of my friends over at Send Cut Send, I made two towers which hold onto this 1-inch tube at exactly the right height and angle. This is one of the things I love about laser cut parts. They are their own fixtures. You don't need to hold anything in place. You just design the parts to locate correctly on the structure and then just weld it together. There are three main forces we have to deal with on this structure. One is push starting the car. I have this roller back here to help with that. The structure has a direct path from that to the main frame with some triangulation because all good structures need triangulation. The second force is aerodynamic, mostly from that stabilizer. I still need to do some analysis on this to see what kind of forces this thing actually sees. Obviously at really high yaw angles it will be a lot, but if the car is at 40 degrees of yaw and the stabilizer hasn't straightened it out yet, there's probably something catastrophic happening. Once I get the stabilizer mount figured out, I can reinforce it as needed. The last force we need to worry about is the parachute pull slowing the car down. I did this calculation with the previous tail, determining that the 4 bolts I had designed it with could carry so much load that the resulting force would cause the submarine belt to explode my testicles. So I decided to back it off this time with only 2 bolts. You might be wondering what these small tubes are for. Well, I was going to use these as bolt holes coming in from the back, but I decided to switch it around after I already welded it. I want to be able to take off the tail with the body of the tail still attached. So I made it to where you just have to take off the engine cover to get to the bolts. Also, some of you are going to point out that I could anchor the parachutes to the main frame instead of the tail, and that I wouldn't have to worry about the parachute drag force going through the bolts that hold the two parts together. I didn't do that for 2 reasons. One is because that adds a level of complication in removing the tail from the car, and I want to be able to remove the tail relatively easily for transport and storage. The other reason is that this connection needs to be pretty strong for the push starting force and the aerodynamic force, and once it's strong enough for that, it's pretty much already strong enough for the parachute pull. Probably. You know what? Let's do the math on this. There's a hook at the bottom that has an area in shear of about 3/8 of an inch, and there are 2 bolts at the top with a total area of 141 thousandths of an inch. In shear, steel can only withstand about 60% of its tensile strength, so taking the strength of these materials in shear, the bolts being 3 times stronger than mild steel, and multiplying them by the area, we get a failure of about 24,000 pounds. This is about 18 Gs of deceleration, enough to smash my nads into the safety belts, but about 5 times stronger than the line holding the parachute to the car, so we should be good. Other than the structural connection, there are 3 things that need to attach to the tail, 2 cables to release the parachutes, and an electrical kill cable. I activate the parachutes on this car with a button. This opens a solenoid that pushes air into this cylinder, pulling it back and pulling the parachute cable. The first time around, I had these kind of haphazardly mounted in the rear, and I didn't like it. I was also using a set screw as a way to disconnect the cable to take the tail off, which was terrible. Huge pain. So this time I built a tower to hold the actuators and the solenoids. It has the exhaust running underneath it with some heat shielding on there. I'm also going to sleeve this whole exhaust here. I haven't figured out a quick exhaust connection yet, but that should be relatively easy, maybe a band clamp. As far as connecting the cables to the solenoid, I think I'm going to use quick air connections. They have a collar that slides forward and locks the retaining balls into the groove in the other side. Super easy, quick disconnect, and that should hold a lot of force. These cables shouldn't have very much load on them since the actuators are designed to bottom out before the cable stretches, but I'd like them to be pretty durable just in case since they are safety related. There are only 2 parachutes, but I have 3 cylinders because I need that 12-volt electrical cable kill switch on the tail. I don't need a pneumatic cylinder for this, but I decided to just do the same thing as the parachute cable since I had an actuator lying around. By rule, you have to have a way to turn off the electrical system at the front or rear of the car, and since the front is very aerodynamically sensitive, it's going on the rear. You don't have to have the actual switch on the back, just a way to actuate it. This is what I had last time, just a pull T-handle, and I'll probably do something similar except without all the rust. And now it's time for Superfast Matt's Super Stupid Mistake of the Week. The other side of the cable's attached to the tail structure with these 3 cable adjusters on a piece of laser cut steel. Fun story, while I was welding this on, I had a little fire. See this plate here? It is grounded to the welder and I'm welding on the metal frame, but there is no metal connection between the metal frame and the grounded plate. Some of you may know that carbon fiber conducts electricity, so I had all of the current of the welder going through the carbon fiber tube and into the frame, and it didn't like that, so it caught on fire. I cleaned it up and reinforced it back with some fiberglass and printed a plug to hold it in shape, so, oops. This is my favorite part of the new tail, the parachute release. Most of the time on a system like this, parachutes are released by pulling a cable that holds a flap down. The cable goes through a cone or a bent piece of steel holding the grommet down. I wanted to get away from this for 2 reasons. One is that I just don't like it. It's a pain to put the flap back on. You kind of need 3 hands to do it. And more importantly, you need access to the side of the tube with those 3 hands, which means the tube needs to stick out a lot. And I don't want this. So I thought, why not just a buckle? Why not just a buckle with a cable release? I looked around and didn't find what I needed, so I made it. It's simple, just an arm that the cable housing attaches to, another arm that the cable itself is clamped to. When you pull the cable, that rotates, releasing this hook here. A spring pulls it back in place, so you can just shove the buckle in and it latches down. One hand. I printed a couple of these at first to get the size and feel right. This is a great use of a 3D printer. You get to see it in real life. It's just one step closer than CAD. Once I had the design where I wanted it, I had Send Cut Send laser cut them out of some aluminum for me. This worked great, except for a couple of things that I had to fix because I have terrible foresight. I needed the buckle of the flaps to be horizontal, so I designed a small part to be welded on. This was fine, except that the loops that originally came with the flaps were brass, not steel, which I didn't find out until I welded them. So I had to buy a new stainless buckle to weld on and slide onto the nylon webbing. The other issue is that I forgot to add a parachute safety pin. You always need a safety pin in your parachute when you're not actually racing, so it doesn't fly out while you're trailering your car to the race. I forgot to make a provision for this, so I added one later by welding on this little bit of aluminum here, and I just slide in this quick release pin and it's all locked out. I will need to cut 2 small holes in the body for this, but it shouldn't affect aerodynamics that much. And that's about it. Almost a tail. I still need to finish that fiberglass body part for the tail and a few other small things, but it's almost ready to go, and it is significantly better than the first try in pretty much every way. So there you go. If you want something done right, do it wrong first. It used to be that you had to impress people to get people to watch your show. Now you just have to impress the algorithm. So do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. All hail the algorithm.